A regime just lost its ruler in war, installed his son in the middle of national trauma, and still cannot put that new leader clearly in front of the world. That is not a detail. That is the warning. Because when a state built on fear, ritual, and control cannot show you the face of power, the first thing you should ask is not what it says. You should ask who is really in command. And in Iran right now, that question may be more dangerous than any missile in the sky. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and support our work. That support helps us keep producing sharp, serious analysis on the political and economic forces shaping the world around us. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. A new supreme leader, a missing appearance, and a dangerous vacuum. What happened in Iran is not just a succession story. It is a stress test of an entire power system under fire. After Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening phase of the United States-Israeli assault, the Islamic Republic moved fast to elevate Mojtaba Khamenei. On paper, that looks like continuity. In reality, it looks like emergency management. And there is a world of difference between a stable transfer of authority and a wartime handoff inside a regime whose survival depends on the appearance of control. That is why Mojtaba Khamenei's absence matters so much. He did not emerge live before the nation. He did not deliver a direct address in his own voice to shut down rumors, steady the elite, and impose authority at the very moment authority was most needed. Instead, his first message was read on state television. In a normal system, that might be unusual. In Iran's system, it is deeply revealing. Because supreme power there is not just legal. It is theatrical. It is symbolic. It is enforced not only through institutions, but through visible command. When the man at the top is missing, the system starts to speak louder than the individual. And when that happens, real power may already be shifting behind the curtain. Reports that Mojtaba Khamenei suffered injuries on the first day of the war only deepen that uncertainty. A fractured foot. Facial wounds. Bruising. None of that automatically disqualifies a leader from ruling. But leadership in a crisis is not just about being alive. It is about being present. It is about being seen. It is about convincing allies, rivals, markets, and your own security apparatus that the chain of command is firm. If that confidence breaks, even slightly, every major actor around the regime begins adjusting. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, adjusts. Political insiders adjust. Foreign governments adjust. Oil markets adjust. And that is where this becomes bigger than Iran's internal politics. Because the world is not watching a calm succession. It is watching a possible vacuum at the center of a heavily armed state sitting on one of the most strategic energy choke points on Earth. If Mojtaba Khamenei is weak, hidden, or constrained, then the danger is not that Iran becomes passive. The danger is the opposite. Systems like this often become more aggressive when leadership looks uncertain. Why? Because force can compensate for doubt. Escalation can mask fragility. A regime under pressure often believes hesitation invites collapse. That is why the optics are so bad for Tehran. State media leaning on archival footage and even AI-generated imagery does not project confidence. It projects strain. It tells us the regime is trying to manufacture continuity because it cannot fully demonstrate it. And when a government starts manufacturing certainty, it usually means uncertainty is already spreading through the structure. So this is the first and most important question of the entire crisis. Is Mojtaba Khamenei truly governing Iran, or is Iran now being governed through him? That distinction will shape everything that follows: military escalation, regional stability, oil prices, and America's next move. Because when a wounded regime cannot clearly show its leader, the vacuum it creates does not stay empty for long. It fills with hard men, hard institutions, and hard decisions. And that is when history becomes most dangerous. What Mojtaba's first message really said: no reform, no retreat, no off-ramp. Mojtaba Khamenei's first message as supreme leader was not important because it was dramatic. It was important because it was disciplined. Every line pointed in the same direction. No reform. No retreat. No serious path out. That is what makes it dangerous. A lot of people hear speeches like this and focus on the emotion. The threats. The revolutionary language. The calls for unity. But when you strip away the ceremony, what remains is far more revealing. Mojtaba Khamenei did not use his first major statement to widen his room for maneuver. He narrowed it. He did not try to calm markets, soften the war narrative, or reassure a population living under deep economic pressure. He chose something else. He chose to lock his authority to the hardest line available inside the Iranian system. That matters because first messages are rarely accidental. They are signals to multiple audiences at once. To the Iranian public, he was saying the state will not bend. To the IRGC and the security elite, he was saying their worldview still governs. To the United States and Israel, he was saying pressure will be answered with more pressure. And to the wider region, he was saying Iran intends to keep using instability as leverage until others absorb the cost. Look at what he emphasized. He defended the continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz as a tool of pressure. That phrase alone tells you almost everything about the strategic mindset now driving Tehran. The Strait of Hormuz is not being described as a temporary battlefield complication. It is being framed as an instrument. A mechanism. A lever to shape outcomes. In other words, Mojtaba Khamenei is telling the world that Iran intends to turn geography into power and economic pain into political bargaining strength. He also made clear that United States bases in the region remain legitimate targets. Again, this is not just rhetoric. It is a declaration of strategic doctrine. Iran is not limiting the conflict to symbolic retaliation. It is signaling a broader theory of confrontation. If Washington projects force into the region, Iran will keep raising the cost of that projection. That is classic coercive logic. Tehran cannot outbuild the United States. It cannot outspend the United States. But it believes it can outcomplicate American power. What is missing from the message is just as important as what is inside it. There was no serious discussion of economic reform. No acknowledgement that ordinary Iranians have endured years of inflation, sanctions, lost purchasing power, corruption, and social frustration. No sign that Mojtaba Khamenei intends to answer the crisis of daily life with anything larger than patriotic sacrifice. That is a revealing choice. It tells us the regime is still prioritizing survival of the state apparatus over recovery of the nation. From a political economy perspective, this is a familiar authoritarian pattern. When pressure rises, leadership does not always respond by improving performance. Often it responds by hardening control. It wraps itself in national struggle, shifts public attention outward, and treats internal reform as a secondary issue or even a threat. Mojtaba Khamenei's message fits that model with striking precision. It was not a governing agenda. It was a fortress doctrine. There is another important layer here. His language was far closer to the instincts of the IRGC than to the more conditional tone previously associated with Masoud Pezeshkian. That contrast is not cosmetic. It tells us where real weight sits inside the Iranian system. Civilian language can suggest flexibility. The security state speaks in terms of deterrence, punishment, and endurance. Mojtaba Khamenei chose the language of the security state. And that is the real takeaway. His first message was not designed to solve Iran's crisis. It was designed to define the terms of endurance inside it. He is not presenting himself as the man who will rebuild the country after shock. He is presenting himself as the man who will preserve the system through shock, no matter how much pressure that places on the region, on global energy markets, or on the Iranian people themselves. So when we ask what Mojtaba Khamenei really said, the answer is brutally simple. He said the old order is still in charge. He said the regime will protect itself before it reforms itself. He said economic pain, regional instability, and prolonged confrontation are acceptable costs if they preserve the structure of power built under Ali Khamenei. And once a leader makes that choice in his first defining message, the road ahead becomes much narrower, much harder, and much more dangerous. The Strait of Hormuz, Iran's asymmetric weapon against the global economy. If you want to understand how Iran still holds real power in this crisis, do not start with fighter jets, missile counts, or headline military comparisons. Start with the map. Start with the narrow strip of water that links the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. Start with the Strait of Hormuz. Because that is where a weaker state can still threaten a stronger world. That is where Iran turns geography into leverage, and leverage into fear. This is the brutal logic of asymmetric power. Iran cannot match the United States in overall military scale. It cannot match Israel in precision or tempo. It cannot outproduce, outfinance, or outlast its adversaries in a straight industrial contest. But the Strait of Hormuz changes the equation. It gives Tehran something far more dangerous than parity. It gives Tehran the ability to impose systemic cost. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil consumption moves through that corridor. That means the Strait of Hormuz is not just a regional shipping route. It is a pressure point in the circulatory system of the global economy. When that artery is threatened, the damage does not stay local. It spreads outward into oil markets, shipping insurance, freight decisions, inflation expectations, bond yields, consumer confidence, and political calculations in capitals thousands of miles away. That is exactly why Mojtaba Khamenei's message about keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed matters so much. It was not only a military signal. It was a financial threat aimed at the architecture of the global order. Iran understands something many people in the West still underestimate. In a connected world, you do not always need to destroy supply to create panic. Sometimes you only need to make the route uncertain. That is enough. Ships come under attack. Reports of mines begin circulating. Commercial captains hesitate. Insurers raise premiums. Traders price in risk. Governments scramble. Markets react before the full physical damage is even measured. This is what strategic disruption looks like in the 21st century. The rumor of instability can become an economic force of its own. That is why Iran's tactics in and around the Strait of Hormuz are so effective. Mine-laying, small attack boats, coastal missile batteries, underwater sabotage, and IRGC harassment operations are not random acts of desperation. They form a coherent doctrine. Iran is not trying to dominate the sea in the traditional sense. It is trying to deny normal use of it. That is a critical distinction. This is not about naval superiority. It is about commercial paralysis. Tehran does not need to sink every tanker. It only needs to convince the world that safe passage cannot be taken for granted. And that makes the Strait of Hormuz the perfect battlefield for a sanctioned, pressured, militarily constrained regime. Why? Because the cost of disruption is low for Iran compared to the cost of restoring trust for everyone else. A mine is cheap. Clearing a waterway is expensive. A drone is cheap. Protecting commercial flow across a contested corridor is expensive. A brief attack can create weeks of hesitation. That is not just military efficiency. That is strategic leverage with economic multiplier effects. There is also a historical pattern here. Iran learned during the tanker war in the 1980s that threatening Gulf shipping can force larger powers to react on Iran's terms. That lesson did not disappear. It evolved. Today, the world is even more financially connected, more psychologically reactive, and more exposed to energy shocks moving through real-time markets. In other words, the same method can now produce even wider consequences. For American audiences, this is the key point: the Strait of Hormuz is not a side story in this war. It is the center of gravity in the economic dimension of the conflict. Iran is using its weakest form of strength in the place where strength is most amplified. It is weaponizing location. It is converting vulnerability into influence. And it is forcing the world to confront an old truth that great powers often forget until it is too late: in geopolitics, narrow spaces can create enormous consequences. So when Mojtaba Khamenei insists on using the Strait of Hormuz as a tool of pressure, take him seriously. That phrase is cold, deliberate, and structurally revealing. It tells us Iran is no longer thinking only in terms of battlefield retaliation. It is thinking in terms of financial coercion. It is telling the world that if Tehran cannot move safely, then the world economy will not move safely either. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous. A wounded regime now believes it can reshape the global balance not by winning conventionally, but by making normalcy unbearably expensive. America's dilemma: reopen the strait, protect shipping, or risk a bigger war. The United States now faces one of the hardest problems in modern power politics: how to prove dominance without walking straight into a trap designed by a weaker adversary. That is the real dilemma in the Strait of Hormuz. On television, the answer can sound simple. Reopen the waterway. Protect shipping. Show strength. Restore order. But the real world is much less forgiving. Because reopening a strategic choke point under threat is not the same as declaring it open. And protecting trade in a war zone is not the same as controlling the war itself. This is the distinction Washington must confront. The United States can punish Iran. It can strike Iranian naval assets, target mine layers, hit launch sites, and project overwhelming force into the region. But punishment is not the same as stabilization. That is where Iran has created its advantage. Tehran understands that the world does not need to believe America is weak. It only needs to believe that America cannot restore normal movement quickly, safely, and at reasonable cost. Once that doubt enters the system, the strategic picture changes. That is why escorting commercial shipping is such a difficult proposition. On paper, it sounds strong. In practice, it places American naval power exactly where Iran wants it, inside a narrow, tense, heavily watched zone where small disruptions can create massive consequences. The United States would not simply be protecting tankers. It would be absorbing risk on behalf of the global economy. And every escort mission would carry military risk, political risk, and financial risk all at once. This is where the geometry of the problem becomes brutal. Iran's tools are relatively cheap, flexible, and disruptive. Mines, drones, missile threats, and swarm-style harassment do not need to sink an entire fleet to be effective. They only need to create hesitation. The United States, by contrast, operates high-value assets in an environment where a single miscalculation could trigger a wider war. That is not weakness. That is the burden of being the system's guarantor. Great powers pay more to restore order than smaller powers pay to disturb it. And there is another uncomfortable reality here. American minesweeping capability in the region is not what it used to be. That matters far more than casual observers realize. Clearing a contested waterway is slow, technical, dangerous work. It is not dramatic in the way airstrikes are dramatic, but it is strategically decisive. If the United States cannot clear threats fast enough, then announcements from Washington will mean less than insurance rates in London, tanker decisions in Asia, and fear in commodity markets. That is the cold truth. Markets trust functionality, not speeches. The alliance dimension makes this even more delicate. Gulf states want the Strait of Hormuz secure. They want Iran checked. But they also do not want to become permanent battlegrounds in a conflict whose escalation they cannot fully control. If the United States expands military operations to guarantee shipping, regional partners may gain protection in one sense while feeling more exposed in another. Bases become targets. Infrastructure becomes vulnerable. Political pressure rises inside those states. So Washington is not simply managing Iran. It is managing coalition psychology. For the American public, this dilemma may feel far away, but its consequences will not stay far away. If the Strait of Hormuz remains unstable, the pressure will move through oil prices, transport costs, inflation expectations, and consumer anxiety. Americans may not follow every military briefing, but they will understand a spike in gasoline prices, higher borrowing costs, and a more nervous economy. That is why this moment is not just a naval problem. It is a full-spectrum strategic problem where military choices and economic outcomes are tightly fused. The deepest challenge for Washington is this: it must show credibility without becoming trapped in a mission that expands faster than it stabilizes. Reopen the strait too slowly, and Iran proves disruption works. Escalate too aggressively, and the United States may widen the war while trying to secure trade. That is the razor's edge. America is not simply being tested on force. It is being tested on whether force can still produce confidence. And in the Strait of Hormuz, confidence is the most valuable commodity of all. The market shock, the legitimacy crisis, and what comes next. What we are watching now is not just a war story. It is a transmission system. Pressure in Tehran moves into the Strait of Hormuz. Pressure in the Strait of Hormuz moves into oil. Oil moves into inflation. Inflation moves into bond yields, mortgage rates, and household anxiety. And all of it circles back into politics. That is why this moment matters so much. The battlefield is no longer confined to missiles, drones, and naval threats. It now runs straight through the global financial system and into the daily economic life of ordinary people, especially in the United States. The market reaction is already telling us something important. Investors are not treating this as a temporary headline shock. They are treating it as a structural threat. Brent pushing back toward and above $100 is not just a commodity move. It is a signal that traders see risk to flows, not just noise in the news cycle. United States stocks falling, Treasury yields climbing, volatility jumping, and the dollar strengthening all point to the same conclusion: the market is repricing instability. It is beginning to factor in the possibility that this crisis will last longer, cost more, and spread further than many hoped. For Americans, this is where geopolitics stops being abstract. Higher oil prices are never just about oil. They bleed into transportation, food distribution, air travel, manufacturing costs, business confidence, and family budgets. One reason these crises feel so politically explosive in the United States is that the pain arrives in layers. First it is gasoline. Then it is inflation pressure. Then it is the sense that the economy is becoming harder to navigate just as households are trying to regain footing. That is how a conflict thousands of miles away starts shaping political moods at home. But the other half of this story is inside Iran, and it may prove just as consequential. Mojtaba Khamenei is trying to establish authority at the exact moment the system around him looks both aggressive and brittle. He has inherited not only the position once held by Ali Khamenei, but also the burden of proving that he is more than a name placed on top of a wounded machine. That is the legitimacy problem. Power can be transferred by decree. Legitimacy cannot. It has to be built, demonstrated, and believed. And right now, Iran's leadership is asking the country and the world to believe in continuity at a moment defined by rupture. That is why his posture matters so much. Mojtaba Khamenei appears to be making a strategic bet. He is betting that resistance can unify the hard core of the regime more effectively than reform can unify the country. He is betting that confrontation can discipline the system from above and silence doubt from below. That may work in the short term, especially with the IRGC and loyal networks closing ranks. But it carries real danger over time. A state can survive on coercion for longer than outsiders expect, yet still weaken in legitimacy with every month of hardship, every missed reform, every broken economic promise, and every sign that elite survival matters more than national recovery. Masoud Pezeshkian represents the softer language of conditional flexibility, but softer language does not automatically shape state direction. In Iran, the deepest power still sits closer to the security structure than to civilian presentation. That means the country may continue speaking in the language of endurance even as its society absorbs more strain. And when that gap widens too far, the regime may preserve control while quietly losing trust. So what comes next? My view is this: Iran will keep using the Strait of Hormuz as leverage as long as it believes economic pressure gives it strategic value. The United States will face rising pressure to restore confidence, not just demonstrate force. Markets will remain on edge until shipping security feels real, not rhetorical. And Mojtaba Khamenei will continue to project strength, but the question of whether he truly commands durable legitimacy will not disappear. The greatest danger ahead is not simply escalation. It is miscalculation layered on top of fragility. A nervous market. A wounded regime. A contested waterway. A superpower under pressure to prove it still guarantees order. That is an unstable mix. And in moments like this, history does not move in a straight line. It lurches. In the end, Mojtaba Khamenei's story is not simply the story of one man stepping into power. It is the story of what happens when leadership is born in crisis, when authority is tested before it is fully established, and when a nation under fire tries to project strength while the world sees uncertainty. He rose to the position of supreme leader not in a moment of calm, but in the middle of war, grief, and strategic shock. His first message did not offer reform, relief, or a path toward stability. Instead, it signaled endurance, escalation, and a willingness to use pressure points like the Strait of Hormuz to force the world to feel Iran's pain. That made him more than a political successor. It made him the face of a system fighting to preserve itself at any cost. But this story carries a deeper lesson for all of us. Power without trust is fragile. Control without legitimacy is unstable. And when people or institutions ignore reality, avoid reform, and depend only on force, the cracks do not disappear, they grow. In life, the same principle applies. You cannot build a strong future by hiding weakness, postponing hard truths, or protecting appearances at the expense of substance. Real stability comes from clarity, discipline, responsibility, and the courage to face problems before they become crises. For all of us watching from afar, this is a reminder that the choices made at the top of power structures eventually reach ordinary lives, through prices, security, opportunity, and peace of mind. That is why understanding politics and economics is not optional anymore. It is part of understanding the world we live in. Here's a quick question for you. Do you believe Mojtaba Khamenei's rise will strengthen Iran's system, or expose its deeper weakness? A. Strengthen the regime in the short term. B. Expose the regime's deeper fragility. Comment A or B below. And I also want to hear your view. Do you think this crisis is mainly about war, or is it really about power, legitimacy, and control of the global economy? Share your opinion in the comments so everyone can read and compare perspectives. And subscribe to the channel to support our work and keep us motivated to bring you more sharp, meaningful analysis in the next video.